Joining me to discuss Israel's information warfare effort is Sut Jhally. He's a professor of communication at the University of Massachusetts and founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation. Good to see you. You produced the documentary, The Occupation of the American Mind, in 2016, which highlighted Israel's public relations strategy. And of course, I was a part of that film. This has been called Hasbara. Can you talk about what the Hasbara strategy is and whether or not it's been effective?
It's what Israel has been doing since at least 1982. 1982 was when, in the invasion of Lebanon, their control of information wasn't that great, and there was a lot of very negative stories on American media. And since then, they decided they're not going to let that happen, and they're going to control American media and the stories and narratives that appear on American media in relationship to the situation in Israel-Palestine. They're going to control that very closely. And the overall strategy is called Hasbara. It's a PR propaganda strategy to make sure that the stories that the American public hear come from, have the narrative that Israel would like to have.
Back in March, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu complained to a high-level meeting of Israeli parliament that the problem with the Hasbara strategy is not just social media, not just other narratives, but he said it's because he was, quote, surrounded by people who can't put two words together in English. Since October 7th, we've seen some very clumsy attempts at propaganda. I'm thinking about the supposed list of Hamas operatives in Al-Shifa hospital. That was just a calendar in Arabic. Amateurish, like digital renditions of a supposed Hamas command center under that same Shifa hospital. How does a government that has cutting-edge technology, a qualitative military edge, all the diplomatic and political power, how are they this incompetent at messaging in the 21st century?
Well, I think they have structures that they're used to. They're used to dealing with kind of, this is how we deal with American media. American media are totally under control. But I think October 7th, and this is what they're dealing with, October the 7th was such a shock to them. In one sense, it was humiliating, of course, not in one sense, but it was a humiliating defeat where, the Israeli military was simply overrun. By a few battalions of Hamas, and I think they were in a panic. And I think they're not used to. They simply did not. Simply didn't think that there would be this level of opposition to them. And so when the level of opposition is so great, as it was in this case, and they have to kind of think on the fly, then they do these amateurish things. I mean, but I also want to say, these things become apparent after a while, but when they first happen, there is no questioning of it. And when it first happens, it's like the stories about the beheaded babies. I mean, clearly something that was made up, but it performed its function in the short term, even though in the long term it has been totally debunked.
Let's talk about that for a second. I mean, you're right. I mean, after October 7th, there were so many alleged atrocities committed by Hamas that were being reported. And to be sure, war crimes were committed by Hamas. But some of the most egregious claims, like the 40 beheaded babies by Hamas in Kfar Aza, or the idea that they were ripping out the fetuses of pregnant Israeli women, these ideas were later debunked. These horrific claims were illustrated in great detail later to be false, but in the moment, they were accepted wholesale by mainstream corporate media outlets. And CNN, CBS, Fox, I mean, I can go past it. President Biden even said at some point, yeah, I saw the pictures. What role does this kind of complex of media and powerful people co-signing false narratives, how does that influence public opinion?
Well, in the short term, I think, again, as you said, I mean, the claims are so outlandish, but what Israel needed to do was to get political space to be able to operate and to essentially, destroy Gaza. And for the first few weeks, that is what they did. There was no opposition because every time anyone raised any opposition, these stories would be brought up. That we're dealing with barbarians, that we're dealing not with civilized people, we're dealing with people, who are not like us. And therefore, you have to take these very, very extreme measures, like flattening the whole of Gaza. So again, the atrocity propaganda works. It only needs to work in the short term. Let me go back. I mean, there's some historical examples of this, right? If we go back to the first Gulf War, back into the early 1990s, early 91, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait. There was not much support among the American population to oppose that, and so there was a propaganda campaign run, actually focusing on Iraqi soldiers ripping babies out of incubators and leaving them on the floor to die. And this then became what American public opinion was rallied around. So these atrocity stories, these atrocity fabrications, they have a short-term goal, even though later on they are proved to be false.
On the other hand, just this week, we've seen video footage from the Tel Sultan refugee camp in Rafah, where a man is screaming in horror, holding up a dead baby whose head had been blown off. We've heard accounts of parents and children being burnt alive inside of their tents. And yet, despite the fact that these atrocities have been confirmed, we haven't seen the same media outrage. We haven't seen the same political outrage from the White House or anywhere else in the mainstream. Why are we seeing such a sharp contrast between how a baby or any human being is treated in Israel versus how a baby or any human being is treated in Palestine?
And again, I think for that is you just have to look to see what the function of the mainstream media is. The function of the mainstream media when it comes to foreign policy is to tell stories from the viewpoint of our allies. Noam Chomsky, a long time ago in a book with Edward Herman, talked about, he said there are sympathetic victims and unsympathetic victims. And sympathetic victims are the victims that are caused by our enemies. And so whereas unsympathetic victims are the victims that are the people that we've killed, that we're responsible for. And therefore, the beheaded Palestinian babies, they're not like us. They're barbarians. They're Muslim savages, and therefore we don't have to think about them in the same way. And I mean, you're outraged about this, as you should be, as anyone should be, and as I think more and more people are being outraged by this, and that is, I think, changing the conversation within the country. So in one sense, I think Israeli Hasbara has really broken down, and it's broken down on the edges, but it's increasingly making its way into the mainstream.
The American right-wing pro-Israel group, Stand With Us, has claimed that your film, quote, unambiguously accuses American Jewish leaders of involvement in a semi-secret conspiracy, and therefore they're arguing that you perpetuate the trope of, quote, nefarious Jewish scheming. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the argument that you're advancing anti-Semitism through your critiques and through the way that you critique the media and the Israeli government?
I mean, my first response is I simply haven't watched the film, because in the film we explicitly say that this is not about a Jewish lobby. This is about the Israel lobby, and the Israel lobby is made up not just of Jewish groups. It's made up of Christians. It's made up of American politicians. It's made up of American media. So this is not about religion. This is not about and it's not done as a conspiracy. This is done quite openly, out in the open. But by being accused of being anti-Semitic, it's a way of trying to shut down the discussion. It's a way of trying to shut down the very careful analysis that we give in this, and to instead paint us in these very broad ways. The interesting thing is that these accusations are no longer working, because I think there are broader stories around this now, and a lot of the opposition, of course, to what Israel is doing, comes from Jews, comes from non-Zionist Jews. There was Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster.
Yeah.
He did some research recently, and the results of it were leaked at the Gray Zone. And he said, the two most dangerous things to Israeli propaganda and to Israeli narratives, the two most dangerous things are when Jews speak out against Israeli policy, and when you see the images of what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Those two things are the most negative things that work against Israeli propaganda. And so when young Jews are saying, for me to be a Jew, for me to live up to my values of Judaism means to stand up against what Israel is doing and stand for the Palestinian people. And I think that's one reason why the anti-Semitism claim, the anti-Semitism accusation is simply not working anymore, because there's so much, counter evidence to it.
Sut Jhally, thanks so much for joining us on UpFront.
Thanks very much.